The Table, brought to you by the Long Steel Rail Press. If you'd like to buy me a cup of coffee, you can do that below this video in the links section there. Or you can go to thethreadinthequilt.com. Thethreadinthequilt.com. Chapter 1. The Table on Christopher Street. I love New York in June. How about you? Once upon a time, a friend of mine, more an acquaintance, set up a table on the roof of her apartment overlooking Christopher Street in the East Village, New York City. I remember a small table with a candle and a Coca-Cola in a cooler, a clear, bustling big city night sky in June 1994. The rant for the Beat Poets Insomniacathon was over, and I was staying at the place my friend had suggested, the Gershwin Hostel. I had already made several trips into the village before this night, but hadn't wandered over to the Christopher Street section yet. So, with large buildings as my backdrop, I pondered why she was not home. I wondered why she decided to skip out on our meeting. The note on the door? She left a note explaining her absence and inviting me to go up the steps, even further, to the roof, to find the setting that she had prepared for my evening. I had walked from the Gershwin many times before this night and had spent hours in Washington Square Park, but this night and that table is something that enters my mind more these days. My friend's mother, at some point in my madness, was the psychiatric nurse at the University of Louisville Hospital who would make the decision that I was crazy enough to be awarded a state grant to the loony bin, free of charge. I have not seen my friend since New York in '94, nor her mother. That old hippie woman who would come into the Good Neighbor Food Co-op, where I was a cashier, and hand out gum to the workers. She would tell everyone as she handed them a single piece of gum from the package, that gum, as it was chewed, changed your attitude. It did something to your brain. It gave you an edge, but it also made you positive. On the table was a blank book and a pen. The table was small enough for one person. There was a waist-high wall, somewhat of a barrier. The wall was red brick with aluminum sheeting on the top that went around the entire barrier of the roof. Over at the Gershwin, I got a job working as a security guard and housekeeper. Part of my job was to keep the drunken Irishmen, who were fans of soccer, from walking around the barrier wall of the 23rd floor roof garden. I think the World Cup was in town and people from all over the world were staying at the hotel. I don't know jack shit about soccer, but on one of those hot June nights, one of the Irishmen passed out in his chair and started playing soccer in his drunken state. The men yelled and joked him until he fell back into his chair. The Gershwin Hostel was a perfect place to stay. I was just one of the humans, the folks coming to New York City to participate in what we call in this country freedom to roam. I remember fondly looking over that wall on Christopher Street. I remember the enticing red lights of a noisy June night in New York City. I remember a lonesome feeling that was quite warming. I was free, a Kentucky boy, way out of his natural habitat and thriving in a world that was full of glances and stares, full of gimmick and wonder. My friend was living with a Jewish man who I think was gay, or maybe she was, but they were trying to get married. Ron Whitehead failed to mention that we would not, even though we were led to believe that we would have a place to stay. My friend of the table, by the way of a phone call, has suggested the Gershwin. Ron was too busy organizing an escape from town with 150 of Louisville's finest musicians, poets, and writers in tow to be much help finding a place. So somewhere between a phone call and some luck, there was a place for us to stay and a table for me to sit at. Christopher Street in New York City is located somewhere in that place many write and dream about, the village. I was walking everywhere. I would walk all the way from the Gershwin to Washington Square Park many times. I really enjoyed all the street folks and their theater. The night I strolled over to Christopher Street, I remember a street person jumping out from in between two buildings with plastic bottles. He had two water bottles screwed into each other to form a fake camera. On the top of one of the bottles, to make it look like it was an old-time camera. It had a flash, and that was the metal end of a broken light bulb. Slipping out of the shadows and onto the sidewalk, he yelled, "Tourist photos!" and asked if I wanted my picture taken. I had lifted my shirt, exposing my fat belly, the same fat belly that Allen Ginsberg had patted, or was going to pat soon, and said, "Hell yes!" I gave him $1 and made my way into the night, to the place with the table on the roof. Good show. The steps and walls leading up to the door with the note were gray and illuminated blue by fluorescent, spooky, flickering lights that were randomly scattered in the hallway. Some of the lights were burned out and cast weird shadows down the bare hallway that were long, drab, and dark, ominous, like a scene in a movie. Her apartment was small. I remember her telling me how much her rent was. I was amazed at the price for such a closet. The apartment I had back home in Louisville was the bottom floor of an old Louisville Victorian house. 8 people lived comfortably in that joint. The rent for her closet was the same as the rent at my community center apartment. The lights of Christopher Street, I am sure, were included in her habitat. I bet the street people with all of their games and all the fake theme bars were also a part of the deal. I am telling this story from memories that are being drudged up from a clinically manic time in my life. I had already been diagnosed with some sort of problem before my northern walkabout. My friend's mother, in the initial conversation that allowed me asylum at the Kentucky Central State Mental Hospital, included a question. How much LSD have you done in your life? I didn't know the answer, but I estimated a couple hundred hits. She was taken aback and said, "Shit, that's like Woodstock days or something." At some point in this very mixed up story, I was in New York City at the rant for the Literary Renaissance celebration of the Beat Poets, laying on the floor with my friends under a grand piano, watching all the folks who did have a place to sleep walk in and out of the NYU guest suites. I remember my friend and poet Ron Whitehead making sure that we were safe. I also remember the fatigue of travel that was playing tricks on my mind. I remember a clock tower rising above Union Square Park, its yellow beige, black lit up golden face, its big black hands, and the time of about 5 a.m. I remember the hands didn't seem to move very fast, and not being able to sleep was a burden. A writer friend of Ron's at some point came around and told us that it was cool for us to sleep there. There was no other place for us, the percussion ensemble named Prana, to go. I think the person's name was Douglas Brinkley. I can't remember the detailed timeline, the people, places, and things, but I do remember the fat belly from a couple thoughts ago. I'd been up for a long time, wandering in the village. It was early morning, and I had not slept. Ron Whitehead and a bunch of folks were gathered around a person talking out in front of the NYU Loeb Theater. In the night, I had found some Africans selling golden amber oil on the street and had a vial of it in my pocket. Learning quickly from the street people, the ones with all the gimmicks, I walked right up to the giddy throng and asked the person who was being oogled if he wanted to buy it. Mr. Ginsberg looked at me and said, "No thanks." I was not going to give up that easy, so I suggested that this elixir would make his dick 10 feet big. He said he was not interested. In a last-ditch effort, I suggested that I, indeed, was for sale cheap. That was when he reached out and patted my belly and said, "No thanks, you're too fat for me." I don't remember who else from our group was standing there. I think another Louisville person, photographer named Bill Brown, was there. I do remember Ron's look on his face when I walked up to Mr. Ginsberg. "Shit fire, I was John Paul, and it was New York in June. How about you?" I didn't give a fuck. To be respectful, and the Southern gentleman I am, I politely broke character and told Mr. Ginsberg that I had not read a single word of his writings. I told the little fat Buddha of a man with the camera hanging around his neck that I knew Ron had a deep respect for his work. I then, nonchalantly, went inside the building where I was, or was supposed to be, hosting the open stage. I'm not sure of the timeline that it's the early 1990s. My manic episodes are something that I am thinking about more and more these days. I am also thinking more and more about deep, dark places at the other end of the spectrum and where that took me. Depression. Deep, dark depression that is like the opening scene of Apocalypse Now when Sheen's character gets out of bed, pried open the window blinds, exposing the bright morning sun, squinting, and finds himself in a Vietnam War. Saigon. Shit.